All right. So we'll go ahead and get started then. So my name is Jackie Borchert. I'm the CEO at Vision Forward Association. Very grateful to have you join us for this evening's presentation. We are going to be doing a presentation on Make Your Voting Plan for the November 5th election. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Denise Jess, the Executive Director from the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. Just a couple quick notes. As I mentioned, I am going to be recording today's session. So if you don't want your camera on or want to be muted, please be sure to do that. And in addition, feel free to use the chat feature if you have questions during today's session. And then we will also have a Q&A at the end of Denise's presentation. So without any further ado, I am going to turn things over to Denise.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jackie. And Corey, you can go ahead on the next slide. So I'll introduce myself a little bit more in just a second, but I really want to thank, we had so many great partners help us with this session today. So I really want to take just a moment to do a shout out for these folks to help get the word out, help host the Zoom. So in addition to the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired and Vision Forward, our friends with the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition are great partners in this work. We've also had the support of the Statutory Council on Blindness, the Center for Deaf Blind Persons, ABLE, Beyond Vision, and Industries for the Blind. So we can move forward. So for those who don't know me, I think folks may, but not everybody. So I am, as Jackie mentioned, the executive director with the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired. And with the Wisconsin Council, in addition to providing vision services and education, we work in the public policy advocacy area. And our five advocacy priorities are transportation, education, employment, access to quality health care, including vision rehabilitation services, and civil rights. And our voting work kind of comes under that civil rights umbrella. And we see it as really critical because without the access to being able to vote as people with blindness and vision loss, it really prohibits us from helping to make decisions about who's making decisions about the quality of our life. So in addition to my work as the executive director, I'm very honored to work with the Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition. I co-chair our voting rights and accessibility committee, and I'll talk near the end of the presentation about how you can get involved in the Disability Vote Coalition, because we love more involvement from the blind and low vision community in the state. I also have been appointed by the Wisconsin Elections Commission to serve on the Accessibility Advisory Committee, which meets with the Elections Commission monthly to do what we can to make voting accessible for all people with disabilities and older adults in the state of Wisconsin. And I also serve on the voting equipment review panel. So anytime there's going to be new voting equipment proposed to be used at our elections, that equipment is tested by those of us who are disability advocates to make sure it's accessible and usable, and then we make our recommendations to the Elections Commission for their approval or denial of the equipment. So in our time together tonight, I want to take some time to overview the laws which guide accessibility for those of us that are blind and have other disabilities. And challenges that we face being still able to stuff supporting us in all making a plan to vote.
Denise,
So that we
I'm
can
sorry to interrupt. This is Jackie.
Yeah.
At least for me, your audio was cutting out a little bit.
Oh,
I think
thank you. I'm
helps too
so
for
glad you
others.
said something. Let me take my headset off. I've been having troubles with it, and we're going to ignore if I get screen reader today. Okay, can you hear me better now?
Your default speaker has changed to
Yes, can
Yes.
hear you clearly now. It doesn't seem
Oh,
to be cutting out at all.
fantastic.
your
All right.
default microphone.
We're gonna go rogue then and not wear a headset. So I will hit my silence key when my screen reader starts chattering. So let me just start a little bit back here then. So our evening, we're gonna focus on the laws that are here to protect our right to vote as people who are blind and who have other disabilities, and our rights under those laws, the challenges that we face as voters with blindness, making a plan to vote so that we can exercise our rights and how to manage those barriers, review some key dates. And then how do we really serve as strong advocates besides voting to preserve and garner our rights to vote? And then we'll create some time for questions. So, Corey, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and move forward. So there are four primary laws that help protect our rights to vote as people with disabilities. And I'm going to briefly touch on each of these and what our rights are under those laws. So, of course, there's the ADA of 1990. There's the Help America Vote Act of 2002, sometimes called HAVA. So when you hear people refer to it as HAVA, they're talking about the Help America Vote Act. There's an older federal piece of legislation that, while it was still kind of overridden by the ADA, there are some aspects of it that are still helpful today, and that's called the Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped Voter Act, 1980 from 1984. It's got kind of an awful name in this day and age, using the word handicapped, but it is still a law on the books, and it offers us some protections when we are attempting to vote. And then the last one that we'll talk a little bit about tonight is the Voting Rights Act from 1965. And Corey, we can go ahead and go forward. So under the ADA, under Title II of the ADA, which has to do with all public spaces, all local and state governments are to ensure that people with disabilities have a full right and equal access to vote. The ADA also says that this has to apply for all aspects of voting, from registration to choosing the polling place, to being able to cast the ballot, and that it counts for both election day voting and for absentee voting. And it's supposed to allow for accessibility under the law. We know that there are issues with the ADA, and I'm going to go through those in a couple of minutes, but in the spirit of the ADA, those are our protections for voting. And we can move forward.
1.1.
The Help America Vote Act, which was passed in 2002, really was put in place to remove some barriers for groups of people who are often marginalized in the voting process, and that includes people with blindness and disabilities. So it's supposed to guarantee all of us the right to a private and independent ballot. It also mandates that accessible voting equipment be in all polling places for federal elections on election day. And Wisconsin law says that that equipment needs to be available on all elections, whether or not they're federal. The voting equipment must provide an equitable access to the ballot as it does for someone who is using a paper ballot. But the law does not require that the accessible voting equipment be used for early voting. Lots of counties in the state, primarily some of the bigger ones like Milwaukee County and Dane County, I think Rock County might be included, but I'm not sure, use that equipment, the accessible equipment for early voting, but the law does not require that it be available for us to use for early in-person voting. And we can go forward. So the older piece of legislation, the voting accessibility for elderly and handicapped folks, ugh, I even hate saying the word handicapped, requires that all polling places for federal elections be accessible. And Wisconsin state law reinforces that for any election. And if a polling place, for whatever reason, can't be made accessible, then there needs to be an appropriate accommodation so that people can use it. So, for example, this is why curbside voting is so helpful for many people if the building that the polling place is located in does not have an accessible entryway or has to be up a flight of stairs. And in some of our small communities in Wisconsin, which have much more limited public buildings, that having an accessible building is quite challenging. It's quite problematic. If someone also needs to have a chair or be moved to the front of the line due to disability or age, this law gives us that opportunity to just ask for that, and we should be moved forward in a line. And we can go forward. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, I think we often think about this act when we're thinking about people of color, our Black and brown citizens and neighbors, but it also had positive implications for those of us with disability. So it means that we have access to an assistant who can help us in the voting process if we so choose. And that assistant can be any person we want to help us mark our ballot, except for our bosses, so our employers, or if we are a member of a union, it can't be a union steward. And if someone's on the ballot, they can't help you, they can't be your assistant. It's really important to remember that you have the right to that assistance and that it can even be a poll worker if you need support during the voting process. The other piece about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is that it prohibits declining someone because they can't read the ballot. And this is really critical for us who can't see the ballot, because theoretically, before 1965, we could have been denied the right to vote. Or you can't read this ballot, I'm sorry, you can't vote. So it also prohibits literacy testing and other proof of the ability to read. And we can move forward. So let's break it down a little bit to looking at managing some of these barriers. So even though the 4 laws that we just reviewed are good, they're solid. However, the problem is they're not well enforced. And a lot of times they're not well enforced, not out of anything malicious, but really out of ignorance. So poll workers may not be, and often are not well versed in the rights of people with disabilities and blindness. Elections officials are not often well versed, and certainly they should be, but not all of them are, particularly in some of our smaller municipalities, but even in some of our larger cities. Elected officials are not well versed in the rights of people with disabilities in the voting space, and even voters and their families sometimes are not well versed. So even though those laws are there, there are so many barriers that we encounter on a regular basis when trying to vote. So I'm going to walk us through
the voting process and talk just very briefly about the barriers, but then how to overcome or manage and work with those barriers. So, first of all, we need identification for voting. Wisconsin is a voter ID state. And while many folks might wish that it wasn't so because having that ID is a barrier, there is not currently a political appetite among our elected officials to change that. So we pretty much know we just need to accept it and put our advocacy into other things. So, but we need to be able to get that ID. So, the Wisconsin Department of Motor Vehicles has been a good advocacy partner of ours, and they have set it up so that you don't have to go into the DMV every time your ID needs updating. And for those of us that have a state ID, that's every year. So if you already have a state ID every 8 years. So if you already have a state ID, the next time it needs to be renewed, you can do that online. And we've worked with the DMV to make sure that the online process is screen reader accessible and good contrast, magnifies really well. So basically, we only have to go into the DMV to get a new ID every 16 years. So that provision to renew online is extremely, extremely useful. I've used it. I've used it to skip the trip. If you need to register to vote, the registration paperwork used to only be a piece of paper. Again, we couldn't fill that out privately and independently. We had to have an assistant to do it. So over the years, we've worked with the Wisconsin Elections Commission so that when folks need to register, you can do that at the My Vote website. So myvote .wi.gov, and that site is screen reader accessible as well. And so you can go in, enter your vital information so that you can register to vote. The one challenge to the My Vote website is that we have to upload that ID because they have to have the ID on file. And I've been able to manage to do a screenshot or a photo of my ID and have it be accepted, but it may be a place that you'll need assistance if you don't have your ID on file already, because it's a little challenging to take a picture of the ID and make sure it's in the camera if you can't really see it. So registration and having that proper ID, and we can move forward. Oops, I'm not seeing the screen change yet, Corey. Has it? There we go. Thank you so much. So absentee voting has a number of barriers for those of us who are blind or have low vision or other print-related disabilities like learning disabilities or cognitive or intellectual disabilities. So in Wisconsin, we have no digital accessible ballot. So if you want to vote absentee and you request an absentee ballot, what you will receive is a paper ballot in about 8-point font, which is even difficult for sighted folks to see. So we have been working for a number of years with the legislature to change the state statute or the state law to allow for being able to get a ballot either by email or through a secure portal that would screen reader interface and that you could then return digitally. There are other states that are doing that. Wisconsin law prohibits it. And so we've been working on that law change. The current legislature and the last couple legislatures have been unwilling to make this change. The technology is certainly available. It's not a question of how do we do it, it's the question of changing the law. So because there has been continued resistance to changing the law through legislation, There is currently a lawsuit in the Wisconsin court system. Um, the suit was filed by Disability Rights Wisconsin and the League of Women Voters, and four voters with disabilities from around the state. One is blind, one is legally blind, one and the other two have physical disabilities, which make it impossible for them to mark their own ballot. That lawsuit went to circuit court here in Dane County, and we knew that we were going to need to do it in phases. So our first phase asked for the ballot to be sent to the voter through email and screen reader, accessible and markable. And the judge believed that this was an excellent way to go and honored the injunction, which meant that we hoped we would have an accessible ballot for the November election. The Elections Commission, who was cited in the suit, knew that that was going to take some work, but they supported the judge's decision. The state legislature didn't like the judge's decision, so they appealed it, but in a different court. And that court stayed the injunction, which means they stopped a ballot to be submitted electronically to voters for the November election. So we are re-strategizing and looking at how we can use the Wisconsin Supreme Court to try to move this forward. It won't happen for the November election, but we'll be continuing to work on it in the long haul. If you're interested in following that and you don't already subscribe to our newsletters at the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired, you may want to do that so you can keep track of what's happening with that lawsuit. So other issues facing those of us who want to vote with an absentee ballot is that we're required, we can ask for a Braille ballot, or we can ask for a large print ballot as well. We can definitely ask for those things. Whether or not we get them is really up to the clerk in the community in which we vote. So in the city of Madison and the city of Milwaukee, they're very good about honoring Braille ballots. Able does the production of the Braille ballots in the city of Milwaukee, and Madison clerk's office does the production here in Madison. However, if you are requesting a Braille or large print ballot, my recommendation is to do it as soon as possible, because especially with the Braille ballot, it's a heavy package, and there have been so many mail delivery issues that sometimes folks aren't getting their Braille ballot till really close to the election, which then does not give time to fill it out and send it back with the assurance that it'll be at the clerk's office or at your polling place in time. So as soon as you can, call your clerk and ask for Braille or large print. And remember that they do not necessarily have to give that to you if it causes a hardship for them. So you may have to really work on advocating for them to do that and helping them to know that ABLE would be a great resource for getting that ballot into Braille. We have the right to an assistant when we're completing that absentee ballot. So again, reminding you that that's a person of your choosing, unless it's your boss or your union steward. And the assistant can also be your witness, and that's really important. That question comes up a lot. Can my assistant be my witness? And yes, they can. It can be the same person. So the person who helps you fill out the ballot can also witness that you're the one completing the ballot, and they can do that sign off for you. We have the right to ballot return assistance. So what that means is if you're not feeling confident about putting it in the mail and having it delivered to your clerk on time, you can ask someone that you trust to deliver your ballot to the clerk's office or to the polling place on election day for you. That was upheld in a court decision 2 summers ago, that ballot return assistance is available for people with disabilities. What we've been discovering, though, is that some clerks don't honor it. So when the family member or the friend returns the ballot, they will say, well, if this isn't your ballot, you can't return it. Yes, they can under the law. So the only questions that your person who's delivering the ballot can be asked by the clerk or an elections official is this your ballot? And if your person who's bringing it back for you says no, then the other question they can ask you is, are you returning it for a person with a disability? And as soon as they say yes, that conversation is supposed to be over. They're supposed to take the ballot from you and make sure that it gets counted properly. It is not okay for the clerk or the poll worker to ask about your disability, to ask why you're not delivering it yourself. They just simply need to take the ballot at this point. And we'll talk a little bit later about what happens if they don't. How do you manage that situation? All right, so we can move forward. Oh, the one other thing I was going to say too, we don't have to go back, but the other thing I was going to say about the absentee ballot is that in the summer, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin reinstated the use of ballot drop boxes. However, they gave communities an out. They said, if you don't want to use them, that's okay. But if you do want to use them, that's okay too. And so many municipalities or many communities in Wisconsin will be using the drop boxes for the November elections, but some have outright said they do not plan to use them. So if you've been following the news, you might remember that in Dodge County, Beaver Dam, I think, is the biggest community in Dodge County. The sheriff said, no, we're not going to use drop boxes. So if you want to use a drop box, which is a secure place to put your ballot, it's locked, it's bolted to the ground, it's a heavy metal box. Call your clerk, your community or your municipal clerk, and make sure that drop boxes are available. All right, let's shift to if you want to vote at the polls. So if you choose to vote at the polls, there are provisions in place that are supposed to create greater access. So there's supposed to be accessible parking, accessible entrance, and a clear path to the polling area. If there is not, again, that is violation of both state law and federal law. Oh, silence my phone. There we go. While you're also at the polls, you have the right to use a signature guide. So when you're signing the poll book, so the poll book has all the names and addresses of everybody who's eligible to vote at that polling area. And there's a tiny box where we have to sign. I often recommend carrying a signature guide with you and asking the poll worker to place it. There are many polling places should have a signature guide in their supplies. The Wisconsin Elections Commission will supply them with those for free. So ask for that signature guide. Some of our polling places around the state are starting to use an electronic signature system called Badger Books. And those are actually easier, I think, for those of us who are blind to manage, because we just need to simply sign on a touch screen, kind of like when we're checking out at a restaurant. And it just gives you a much wider signing space and easy to feel edges. But if your polling place is still using a paper poll book, you have the right to ask for or use that signature guide. We have a right to reasonable accommodations. So that might mean, using a magnifying glass if that's useful for you. And again, it might be asking for a chair, if standing for too long is really difficult. It might be asking for sighted guide to navigate that polling place. And we should be offered the accessible voting equipment by poll workers. Often they don't offer it. The best practice is for a poll worker to say to you, would you like to use a pen to mark your ballot? Or would you like to use the touch screen, which is the accessible voting equipment? They should offer you that choice. And in communities where they're offering that, they see the use of the accessible voting equipment go way up. If they don't offer it to you, you have the right to ask for it. I'd like to use the accessible voting equipment. I think it's important to be prepared for a variety of responses. Sometimes it's like, oh, that's fantastic. Here you go. And they, make sure that you know where that voting equipment is and get you all set up with it. I've had responses that have varied from, oh my gosh, I hope you know how to use the equipment because I don't. And as soon as I hear that, I invite the poll worker for a little lesson on how to use the voting equipment. Sometimes, if they're uncomfortable, they'll try to deter you from using the equipment, reminding you that you can have an assistant fill out the ballot on your behalf. If you want an assistant, you have the right to that. But if you want to mark your ballot privately and independently, you have the right to that. So you may need to stand your ground and insist on using that the voting equipment if you want access to it. And we can go forward. The accessible voting equipment, I'll say some more about that. It is required to be at every single polling place in the state of Wisconsin when those polls open on election day. And I'm emphasizing that because there's inconsistencies on whether it is. It should be plugged in, ready to go. The controller, the ballot marking controller should be in front of the machine, the headphones in front of the machine, so that when we approach it, we can touch the area and know exactly where the tools are that we need. That being set up, ready to go, even having the equipment tested to make sure it's working properly. Some polling places are going to do an excellent job with that. Some are going to do a poor job with that. So again, this might be a place where your advocacy about having that equipment ready to go is going to be very important. If you're concerned about it, you can call your clerk ahead of time and say, I will be voting on election day, and I want to make sure that the accessible voting equipment is set up and ready to go. There's currently a lawsuit, another one, because there's a small town in Rusk County, which is in the northwestern part of Wisconsin. The town is called Thornapple, and that town's board voted to disallow the use of the electronic voting equipment, which is against the law. It's against federal law, it's against state law, because they have misinformation that somehow the voting equipment is corruptible. That voting equipment is not connected to the internet. All it really is a screen reading and ballot printing device. So voters in that small town of 7,500 people don't have access to that basic right of using the electronic voting equipment. They have been contacted by the United States Department of Justice to let them know they're in violation of the law. And there's a lawsuit currently against the Elections Commission because from the Disability Rights Wisconsin, because of the denial of people who want to use that equipment. And we raise that with you all because we have concerns that some of our smaller communities might be vulnerable to some of that misinformation. So if your community says to you, no, we don't use that here, that's violation of federal and state law. And again, we want to make sure that that is flagged so it can be dealt with. So in addition to that equipment being available and ready to go, there can be a chair set up for someone who would like to sit or needs to sit. The equipment needs to be accessible for someone who's using a mobility device like a scooter or wheelchair or walker. It needs to be placed in the actual polling area. We have heard from voters around the state where the electronic or the accessible voting equipment was in the bathroom, or it was in the hallway, or it was in another room entirely. That's a violation of both the ADA and the Help America Vote Act. So, you have the right to vote in the same place as all other voters. It also has to be set up for privacy. We have had voters let us know that the voting equipment was facing out into the room where other voters could see what you were marking on your ballot. So, make sure that that voting equipment is turned for privacy, has a privacy screen around it. If you can't see or feel that, ask the poll worker or someone who's with you, is this set up for privacy? Poll workers need to be trained on how to use the equipment. Some are not. So again, you may get some resistance or concern about not knowing how to use it. Unfortunately, the state allows counties to choose the voting equipment that they would like to use from a certified list, but there are about 5 or 6 different types of voting equipment used in the state. So, kind of if we trained or did a video on how to use one kind, it would only cover that one kind, and other parts of the state might be using something really different. And that makes training um, both poll workers, but also voters more challenging because it's not universal equipment. And I think that will do it for that screen, so we can move forward. So some other barriers that voters face and how to navigate them, those were really the main ones for those of us who are blind or have low vision or other print-related disabilities. But I think it's important to remember some of these others because of intersectionality. So, some of us may have another disability in addition to blindness, or we may have significant health concerns, or we may be a person of color, or we may be an older adult. So other barriers that voters are facing these days are for folks who are indefinitely confined voters. So these voters are folks who have significant health issues or other reasons for that make leaving their home challenging. And it may not be that it's challenging every single day. For folks, for example, who have MS, they might have a good day, they might have a bad day. And if the bad day happens on election day and they can't get to their polling location to vote, there is a provision for them to be able to get an absentee ballot without having to show that proper ID, and they just need to certify that they are indefinitely confined. There are lots of challenges to indefinitely confined voters, and that have been pieces of legislation that have been introduced in Wisconsin to try to limit indefinitely confined voting. And we have been advocating to kill those bills so that they do not damage the right of indefinitely confined voters. voters under guardianship in the state of Wisconsin, all voters who are eligible to vote can vote, even if they are under guardianship. The only entity that can take away someone's right to vote is a court. So sometimes folks with older adults, the children of those older adults might say, mom can't vote anymore. Her memory's not great. We just don't want her voting. So we're prohibiting her from voting. But unless a court has decided that she's not capable of voting, she still maintains that right to vote. Several years ago, there was a kind of obscure law on Wisconsin books that got pulled into action again that basically says all voters at the polling place have to state our names and our addresses aloud, verbally. And of course, this is a huge barrier for our friends who are deaf and hard of hearing, or who may have speech impediments or other disabilities that make talking really difficult. So there is a state law now that allows someone to state your name and your address on your behalf. So if you need that provision, you can bring a note that, asking the poll worker to read the information that is on your ID, and that will suffice for stating your name. We have heard, though, of voters who were denied the right to vote because they couldn't state their own name and an address, and that is against Wisconsin law. Voting in residential facilities is also a huge issue. So, our older blind folks who are living in nursing homes or care facilities of any sort, there are supposed to be special voting deputies who come to run elections so that they can maintain their right to vote. There aren't often enough of those deputies, and we worry significantly about whether folks in care facilities are actually being able to vote. And curbside voting is really important. So folks who can't get into the polling place, or who have significant health concerns and are worried about transmission of disease, also have the right to do curbside voting. But again, depending on the polling place, that may or may not be honored. And we can move forward. So if you encounter any barriers to voting, we really want to encourage you, if you're at the polling place, do not leave, because often if we leave, we don't come back and we don't get to cast our ballot. So the first thing to do is to request to speak to the chief inspector of that polling place. They're really like the supervisor for the polling place. Let them know what's going on, what you need, cite the law, if you as you understand it. And often, a chief inspector will help in the moment rectify the issue so that you can move forward and be able to cast your ballot. If you are not getting satisfaction from that chief inspector, you have the right to ask for your municipal clerk, for your town or city's clerk, to address the problem. And they should address it also. And if they are not, you have the right to call the Wisconsin, the disability the Disability Rights Wisconsin voter hotline. And that phone number, and I'll say it a couple of times, and we'll also have it, it's in the slides that we can figure out how to share those with you, but it's 844-347-8683. Again, 844-347-8683. And that phone number is answered on election day. It's answered other days as well. During business hours, and you can ask disability voting related questions. You can ask for an assistant, ask for assistance if you're facing a barrier. They can help walk you through what your next steps would be. You can also call the Wisconsin Elections Commission. And I love that our friends at Beyond Vision take the overflow calls for the Elections Commission on Elections Day, but you can call them. The Wisconsin Elections Commission has an accessibility voting rights specialist. Her name is Regina. She is awesome. I work with her quite a bit. So while you may not talk directly with Regina that day, you can ask for assistance, and that phone number is 855-868. Hold on just a second. 3941, and I'll repeat it. 855-868-3541. And if you're a web user, you can look up the Disability Vote Coalition. That disability voter hotline is right at the top of the web page. Again, screen reader accessible website. You can also go to the Wisconsin Elections Commission website and go to the Contact Us page, and that will have the phone number as well. And then if you, after the fact, if you have had an accessibility issue, the Wisconsin Elections Commission has a form, accessible form on their website that you can fill out to file a complaint and let people know what happened. And those complaints are really useful to those of us who are on the Accessible Advisory Committee, because then we can advocate for change. So the more documentation we have, the better off we are for advocating for something to be different, that something needs to be amended, and we can move forward. So there's some key dates coming up for the November election that I want to make sure that we all have our minds wrapped around. So registration and proof of residency. So if you're not a registered voter, you have till October 16th to do that online or to mail in your form. You have till November 1st. If you're going to register with your municipal clerk. And then if you want to register at the polls, Wisconsin is a same-day registration state. And it's certainly fine for you to do that. However, you'll be encountering a paper form. So you would need to make sure that you have an assistant with you to complete that form at your polling place. And we can go forward. Other key dates related to absentee voting. October 31st, so Halloween, is the final day to request an absentee ballot. I frankly would not wait that long. That feels so while the law says you have up until October 31st, you put your request in either by calling your clerk or doing the My Vote page. By the time that ballot is mailed to you, with the delays we're seeing in the US mail, it may not reach you until after the election is over. Or you might get it before the election, but then have difficulty returning it. So, while you can wait that long, I would not recommend waiting that long. October 22nd, in-person absentee voting begins. So this is a great option for those of us who are non-drivers to use in-person absentee voting, or early voting, as many people call it, in our communities. Larger communities often have polling places set up in our libraries. You can go to your municipal clerk's office. And it can help with the transportation barriers that we face because we can maybe make a ride happen with a little bit more ease, or if the ride falls through, we still have other options. So by the 22nd of October, we can vote in person absentee. November 3rd is in-person absentee voting ends. So that's the Sunday before election day. If you're going to use a Sunday, I would call your municipal clerk to make sure they're offering Sunday voting. I know Milwaukee and Madison do, but I don't know if all others do. And then November 5th at 8 o'clock is when your absentee ballot, if you're voting absentee, has to be in your polling place so that it can be counted when the polls close. Yeah, so really be ahead of time on those absentee dates so that you don't get kind of lost in the shuffle. And we can go forward. When you're at the polls open at 7 a.m. and close at 8 p.m. statewide. I've heard people be confused about this. I don't know what time the polls open in my area. I think they close at, and then they have a piece of misinformation, but state law requires that all polls open at 7 a.m. and that they close at 8 p.m. on election day. If you're in line at 8 p.m., you have the right to vote, even if you're not holding your ballot at 8 p.m. If you are in that line, do not leave. And this has been a source of confusion. So sometimes on really high turnout elections, and I expect November's will be one of these, people have been told, oh, you should leave because the polls are closing. Maybe somebody on the street says it to them, or they hear it in the rumor mill, in the line. Do not leave. Stay and cast your ballot, because if you are in line at 8 o'clock, you can stay. Voting in person or early voting or absentee are all good options if you have transportation barriers. So again, if you're worried about getting to the polls on election day and you feel like that's too risky because of your transportation system, your transportation choices, then definitely vote in-person absentee or mail-in absentee. And we can move forward. Advocacy beyond the voting day is really, really critical. So we really are so appreciative of people around the state who are voting rights advocates. So we want to advocate for our own needs at our polling places with our clerk. So a number of years ago, one of our board members really wanted to use the accessible equipment for early voting. So she called her clerk and said, I can't use a paper ballot because I can't vote privately and independently. I'd really like to use the accessible equipment for early voting because of the transportation barriers. Is that possible? And her clerk said, yes, it is. And it's a small city in the western part of the state. And so she was able to use the accessible voting equipment because she advocated for herself. Now that's not going to happen every time, but if you don't ask, you can't find out if you can do it. If you're worried about that equipment being set up and ready to go, ask ahead of time. So advocate for your needs with your clerk. You're helping your clerk to learn about how to make voting more accessible for all voters with disabilities. Advocate for funding for the Wisconsin Elections Commission. So this next winter, we'll be gearing up for another state budget. And the Elections Commission really benefits from robust funding for a couple of things that are specific to voters with disabilities. So the Elections Commission runs what are called polling place accessibility reviews. And so on election day, trained reviewers go to polls around the state and check to make sure that they are accessible. They bring a tablet with them. They note where there are accessibility problems. And then the clerk for that area, for that town or city, gets a report on their polling places, and then suggestions about how to remedy the problem. It's a really great program, and Wisconsin really is modeling it. But in Wisconsin, Jackie was asking me before we started tonight, how many polling places are there? There's several thousand. So these reviews, they can only conduct a handful at each election, because they are costly. They have to have staff who can go out and do them. So we want to see that program be really robustly funded so that we can do more. They can do more of those polling place audits so that clerks can get the information that they need to correct. And many clerks are very willing to correct once they know what the issues are and how to fix them. The Wisconsin Election Commission also runs an accessibility supply program. So they recognize that, having certain types of things like magnifying glasses and cones to mark accessible parking spaces and signature guides and even some of the cables to make some of the voting equipment easier to use and set up to make it more private, that all costs money, and some of our towns really don't have a lot of financial resources. So they have an accessibility program where they'll get the supplies to those towns for free, and that's a really awesome program. So that program we want to always see be well funded. Other advocacy work is to advocate for accessibility training for all poll workers. This has been an issue that has troubled me for years, is that there are expectations about accessibility training for clerks. I've done several webinars with the Elections Commission for clerks. Clerks are required to make sure that they know what is supposed to happen for voters with disabilities, and then they are supposed to train their poll workers. But there's not a lot of guidance on what that training looks like. So we have been advocating with the Elections Commission to make what's called an administrative rule to make that training more uniform. And so, advocating for that with your legislators would be incredibly, incredibly helpful. And we can move forward. And then here's just a couple of resources that I've mentioned as we've been talking. So we, at the council, Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired, we publish a newsletter weekly. And throughout, the weeks, there are often pieces on accessible voting, what's happening, how to make sure you're exercising your rights. So, and we also issue action alerts when it's appropriate. So if you're not signed up for our newsletters, you can go to our website at wcblind.org and get signed up. The Wisconsin Disability Vote Coalition is a great resource. The website is chock full of information about our rights as voters who are blind and have other disabilities. We do a lot of work with legislators, educating them, educating clerks, and educating voters with disabilities and their families. So you can visit their website at disability.vote.org. And then the Wisconsin Elections Commission is also a really good resource. They have articles on accessibility and what's required. They have that accessibility complaint form. So you can go to elections.wi.gov to learn more about what the Elections Commission is communicating. And we can go forward. And I've included my contact info so that if you want to, reach out to me, if you go to the council website at wcblind.org, you can find on the staff page my phone number and email if you've got specific questions that you want to ask. But we've got time tonight to address questions if folks have them. So I'll stop talking because you've heard from me for a good long time. And I'm hopeful that what I've shared has been helpful. But let's see what questions are living amongst you all. So, Jackie, if you want to help facilitate that, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Denise. That is just such a wealth of incredibly important, valuable information. And I am always so impressed with your knowledge in this area and all the great advocacy work that you do on behalf of our constituents. So thank you so very much. There were not any questions that came through in the chat during today's presentation. However, any of the attendees are welcome to unmute themselves and ask a question, or welcome to use the chat and I can read those questions out loud as well.
Denise, I'm trying to think of a question for you, but you honestly covered so much information, I can't think of one.
Oh, well, hopefully, there was a lot of info, so hopefully
That was
nobody's
good.
head exploded.
No, it was very good information, but yeah, I can't think of anything.
I guess I have a question. This is more just out of my curiosity. Do you have any sense of what choices people with disabilities are making around voting, as in individuals that are choosing to do absentee ballot versus, early voting versus people that are using, accessibility options at the polls? Is there any sort of data collection around that, and any way to know, like, at least in Wisconsin, what methods people with disabilities are choosing to vote?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. So, just kind of overarching, we know that people with disabilities vote in smaller numbers than our non-disabled peers. So the barriers we certainly know are there. What's interesting is that those of us with who are blind and low vision of the disability groups, we tend to vote in higher numbers than some of our other disabled peers. And so I think that's pretty exciting. So it still concerns me that that as a group, we vote less than our non-disabled neighbors, but that of people with disabilities, we have higher voting rates. So I just want to say hats off to all of us because we're encountering some pretty significant barriers to voting. In general, many people with disabilities kind of across the board often prefer some form of absentee ballot, whether it's the mail in kind or the early voting, especially if we're non-drivers, because trying to get to the polls on election day can be so incredibly risky. And if you need an assistant and want to take somebody with you, then you have a whole nother layer of details to try to manage. But for those of us that are blind, that inaccessible absentee ballot is really prohibitive and doesn't honor the dignity of the voter because somebody has to read us the darn ballot. So I think, though, especially folks in rural areas may choose that option and try to find an assistant because of those significant transportation barriers.
Absolutely. And to that point of transportation challenges, you know, are there any specific efforts that are being undertaken, particularly in rural areas, to help to support people with transportation barriers in order to get to the polls, to be able to do voting? I'm just curious, like a paratransit service, something like that,
Mhm.
would transportation, I'm guessing transportation to the polls would not be considered a ride that they would usually support because it's not work or medical related. Where does that fall in terms of
Yeah, it is partly the issue in our rural areas is that the programs that provide rides are significantly underfunded.
mhm,
But another issue that is being faced by those rural communities is that they often use volunteers
mhm,
to provide the rides.
yep,
And the volunteers are required to have commercial insurance, which is super expensive. And so they're losing their volunteers.
mhm,
So that volunteer driver pool is so small right now that they have that, the people running the programs, the ADRCs and, other providers have to be so choosy about which rides they can provide, and they do tend to lean towards medical and food.
mhm,
And so they may or may not be able to provide a ride to the polls for someone on election day, depending on what their volunteer pool looks like, what their funding looks like. So yeah, it's highly risky
mhm,
for depending on those sources. Some of the senior centers, if they have access to their own transportation, will run vans. So but people, kind of have to get either picked up or get to the senior center, but they might provide transportation. So it really means if you're in a rural area, your best bet is to call your Aging and Disability Resource Center, connect with the mobility manager for your area well in advance to find out what your options are for getting to the polls on election day.
yeah, absolutely. Just a lot of barriers there. So it is helpful to know that there are different options, but I like the title of your presentation because it really does seem to necessitate creating a plan
Mhm.
and that this is not something you want to be scrambling to figure out on November 4th.
Nope, nope,
It's
exactly.
it really does seem that it's, that having people develop a strong plan around how they're going
Close
to
that
ensure
chat
that they
button.
exercise their right to vote is something that is going to require a little bit more advanced planning than for people without disabilities. So
Yes, exactly.
I think that's an important takeaway from all of this.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
The accessible voting machines, you said that they're all slightly different. Maybe you could give some detail on how they work. Do you still have like the paper ballot and do you like stick it in the machine or how does it work?
Yeah, I love this question. So in Wisconsin, there has to be a paper ballot. And so some of the voting equipment, yeah, most of it, y- you insert a piece of paper. So anybody who's using equipment called the express vote, and a lot of municipalities are moving to the express vote because it is easy to use and people really like it. It's kind of state of the art with voting equipment. So you get a piece of paper and it has a corner cut off on one side, and you turn that so that it's at the upper right, and then there's a place to insert it. You wear a set of headphones if you're a screen reader user, and those the audio prompts talk you right through how to insert that ballot. And then it will tell you that the machine's going to go quiet while it gets your piece of paper ready to go, and then it literally reads every question that's on the ballot, and then gives you the prompts for how to use the controller device, which is tactile, to mark the ballot. And then you can review your ballot by listening, and then when you're ready to print, it will cue you to hit the square. It will print the ballot, and then you've got that paper ballot in your hands and you walk it over to the tabulator, and it goes into the tabulator to be counted along with everybody else's. The one downside of that piece of voting equipment is that the ballot is actually physically smaller than the ballot that people who are filling it out with paper are using. And so, the issue for me with that and other voters as well is that if you're the only one using that equipment throughout the day, then the anonymity of your ballot is compromised, really, because it's like, oh, Denise voted here. Oh, this must be her ballot. And so we always encourage people to use that equipment. Anybody can use it. It doesn't have to be just a person with a disability. And then there's more of those smaller size ballots in the tabulator at the end of the day. Another highly used piece of equipment in the state is called the Dominion Image Cast Evolution, or Dominion ICE. And we consider this a problematic piece of voting equipment because the older version of it, and many of our counties are still using it. I think 39 of Wisconsin counties are still using it. Means that there's one machine that's both the tabulator and the accessible voting equipment. And so if I come into the polling place, or you come in and you say, I want to use the accessible voting equipment, they have to shut down the tabulator. And so anybody who was marking their ballot with a pen and paper, has to wait to drop their ballot into the tabulator while you vote, because they have to do a physical switch over. And then when you're done voting, and you've printed your ballot and you're ready to put it in the tabulator, they have to do a physical switch back to the tabulator. So it means everybody stops voting. They know you're voting, and they're waiting, and that's a terrible situation to be in. So we have asked a number of times to have that equipment decommissioned. The Elections Commission doesn't favor doing that. So there is a second monitor that can be purchased. And so you don't have to do the shutdown of voting for everybody else. So we've been advocating for municipalities to get that second monitor, and that has included a special grants program, so so that they can afford it. So if you vote somewhere where they use that Dominion ICE voting equipment, I think it's really important to advocate that they have that second monitor, because it's awkward for everybody, and it really compromises the dignity of the person who's using that equipment. But all of them are screen reader accessible. All of them can magnify. So if you don't need the screen reader, but you need magnification and high contrast, they all do that feature, and they all produce a printed ballot.
So Denise, this is Jackie. I'm just going to add one more piece onto this because I'm so glad a question came up about the accessible voting machines. I know the Wisconsin Council a few weeks ago had an accessible voting machine on site, and at Vision Forward on Thursday, October 17th, from noon until 3 p.m., we will have an accessible voting machine, and the machine that's used in all of Milwaukee County available for individuals to try out. And we will have some Milwaukee County elections officials, as well as a representative from the vendor's office for that accessible voting machine, in order to help to support people to get a chance to try it out and get comfortable with that device prior to voting day. So strongly encourage anyone who is considering voting using one of the accessible voting machines, or people who are even just simply interested in how it works and can help to advocate and to educate others about the option. Strongly encourage them to come to Vision Forward for that event on Thursday, October 17th, to get a chance to try it out.
I love that you're doing that. Thank you so much. Yeah, getting your hands on it makes all the difference. If you're not in Milwaukee, and we've done our sharing already for this election, but if you're not in Madison or Milwaukee, one of the things you can do is call your clerk and ask, when is the public testing of the equipment happening? Because it has to be publicly tested before every election. And they should be able to tell you that. And because it's public testing, you can go to that and then be able to get, your hands on and learn about the accessible equipment that day too. So that is another option for experiencing it before election day.
Great. Thanks, Denise. Any other questions at this time?
So I think, Jackie, you mentioned at the start that we've been recording, and
Correct.
we will make the recording available on our YouTube channels. And we'll also be posting about that on our social media and in our newsletter. So if you have friends or family members that weren't able to come tonight, or you want to review, that YouTube will be available soon. We just want to make sure it gets all closed captioned appropriately, etc. But we'll make it available.
Absolutely. We'll look to share that soon. And as Denise mentioned, certainly she provided her contact information. Individuals are also welcome to reach out to Vision Forward at info@vision-forward.org. If you have any questions as well, particularly for people in the Milwaukee area. Honestly, we might end up directing you to Denise because she really is the subject matter expert in this area, but we want to be available to be a resource and to help to support people as well. All right. Well, then with that, thank you again, Denise, for sharing all of your knowledge in this area, and again, for your advocacy work as well. There certainly are some positive things that have happened in terms of ensuring accessibility, but as you've acknowledged, more work to be done. So thank you for your efforts in that. And again, thank you to everyone who attended this evening. Please spread the word. Really important that as many people as possible are aware of the great information shared this evening.
Thanks, everybody. Jackie, thanks for hosting. Corey, thanks for running the tech. Thanks, folks, for attending on a Tuesday evening. I'm so grateful that you were here.
Corey Ballard has stopped screen share. Meeting tab selected. To
All
switch
right.
pages,
Thank
press
you.
the
Take
Control
care,
plus
everyone.
page
Have a
down.
great night.
Yep, take care.
Corey Ballard has left